How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Gimel, Daf 3 of Masechta Zevachim. Friends, okay, here's the dealio for Daf 3. So I'll go through like a little outline of today's Daf, but the thing is, there's really kind of one primary concept for today's Daf that's a little bit difficult to explain on its own, but we're going to get to it right, very pretty in a few minutes, right at the beginning of the Daf, and then we'll discuss it then, and then and basically the whole Daf today is going to be different angles on that principle. So that being the case, here is a brief outline of today's Daf. Slaughtering a chatas as chulin. Okay, so we of course talked yesterday about lishmah, that when you slaughter a korban chatas, or really any korban, really, you have to have intent for it to be that korban. We actually saw, interestingly, the shita of Rabbi Yossi yesterday, who mentioned this Tanai Bezdin, that actually Bezdin encouraged people to actually not have any intention at all, and just have a default to being kosher. But anyways, if you have the intention for a different korban, so whether you're offering a chatas and you have in mind an ola, or you're offering an ola and you have in mind the shlamim, whatever it is, that's going to be problematic. We're going to discuss what if you have in mind chulin, which isn't a korban at all. So that'll be the first section of today's daf. Then there's going to be a chunk, I'd say probably the primary chunk of today's daf, and the real work of today's daf is related to Tumah of vessels within vessels. That's going to be a sugya. That's going to be a sugya. I'm sure everyone's very excited for that one, but it should be cool. We got some photos there to help us work through that one. Hopefully that'll be good. And then finally comparing lishmah and lishem bailim. So this is the Gemara is now going to be introducing for the first time the concept of lishem bailim, right? This, of course, we've been discussing this. Well, lishmah, which another way that the Gemara refers to these concepts. I don't know that we'll necessarily be mentioning it today, but prior, I think already by tomorrow we'll be mentioning them, is shinui kodesh and shinui bailim. Shinui kodesh meaning changing the actual korban itself. So a shlamim you have in mind for an ola or something like that. So that would be shinui kodesh, and shinui bailim is that whatever, it's Ruvain's korban and there's intention for Shimon. How exactly that works, we'll probably touch on it today. But anyways, we're introducing today lishem bailim, making sure that essentially the korban is being offered with the right person in mind. Again, there's some nuance there of what exactly that means. So chevra, it's going to be a gewaltige daf here in Masechta Zevachim. Masechta Zevachim so far, I'm telling you, I'm to daf ches already. Masechta Zevachim is mamish gewalt. It's hard. It's hard, but it's gewaldig. It's hard, but it's gewaldig. So here we go. We're going to jump into Daf Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. Here we go. Okay, friends, we're going to begin on Daf Gimel at the 2 dots, about, I'd say, 15 plus lines into Daf Gimel Amid Aleph at the 2 dots. Su Rami Milsa Achrise. If you remember, friends, yesterday on Daf Beis Amid Beis, on the 3rd line of Daf Beis Amid Beis, we saw, I'll read it, Amalei Ravina L'Rapapa Lohavis Gaban B'Orta B'Tchuma B'Chermech D'Rami Rava Mili Me'al Yisa Adade V'Shani Lu. Right, that Ravina saw Rapapa, and he says to Rapapa, wow, you mamish missed it. You mamish missed it. Rava was in town for Shabbos. He was giving shiurim, and he was asking questions and giving answers. It was mamish gewalt. So yesterday we talked about, I think he was asking about what the default statuses of Zvachim versus Gittin. Was that what he was asking about? I think so. So now he's going to ask. So now here's another question that Rava asked and gave an answer to. Here we go. So Surah Mimilsa Achrisa, and additionally Rava asked another question and gave another answer. Here it is. Mi Omer Rav Yehuda Amar Rav does Rav Yehuda Amarav really say, now we haven't seen this yet, but this is something I think this is from Daf Mem Vav, but apparently we're going to quote a shita of Rav Yehuda Amarav, and Rav is going to question if that could really be his opinion. So the opinion of Rav Yehuda Amarav is chatas sheshchata lishem ola psula shchata lishem chulin kshera alma demina machriv ba de la mina lo machriv ba. Wow, there's a lot there. Okay, so first of all, Rav Yehuda says in the name of Rab that if you slaughter a korban chatas as a korban ola, it's psula. But if you slaughter it as chulin, it's ksher. Again, says Rav Yehuda Amarav that if you have a korban chatas, now technically, look, shchita is ksher bizarre, right? Technically, anybody could slaughter a korban. You don't have to be a kohen to slaughter the korban. But I think that for consistency, since, right, there's, of course, we discussed yesterday the avodos hadam. There's shchita, kabbalah, holacha, and zrika. Shchita is the only one that is ksher bizarre. Kabbalah, holacha, zrika, all has to be done by a kohen. So I'm thinking that even when we discuss shchita, I think I want to just kind of get in the mindset of basically having a kohen doing the avodah, since it's going to have to be a kohen doing kabbalah, holacha, zrika, whenever we talk about those. So I think I'll just assume the same for shchita as well, and just kind of frame things as the kohen doing the avodah. And I'm going to refer to the kohen as Aharon. Of course, normally we work with Reuven, Shimon, Levi, etc., but the kohen is always going to be Aharon. Aharon is going to be the kohen, a good priestly name. So Rav Yehuda Amarav says that if Aharon slaughters a korban for Reuven has to bring a korban chatas. And Aharon slaughters the korban chatas for Reuven, but Aharon has in mind that not that he's slaughtering a korban chatas, but that he's slaughtering a korban ola. So says Rav Yehuda Amarav that that's possible. It's possible. It's not lishmah. A korban chatas has to be slaughtered as a korban chatas. Right? That was the Mishnah we learned yesterday. Korban chatas has to be slaughtered as a korban chatas. If the kohen, if Aharon slaughtered Reuven's chatas as in ola, it's psula. However, says Rav Yehuda Amarav, if Aharon slaughters Reuven's chatas as chulin, as meat to throw, it's a Sunday night, he's going to make a barbecue, have some friends over, he slaughters Reuven's korban chatas as chulin, ksher. That's okay. So says the Gemara, why is that? So Alma, says the Gemara, from here we see, Demina, and I said in the introduction that there's going to be there's one principle that we're going to be working through on today's daf. Here is the principle. The principle is Demina machriv ba Tilab mina lo machriv ba. It's basically apples to apples versus apples to oranges. In order to make something puzzle, we have to have an apples to apples comparison. If you have an apples to oranges comparison, well, it's just apples to oranges, it's irrelevant. So therefore, demina machriv ba, we see that when it's the same type, it can ruin it. So you have a korban chatas that needs to be slaughtered as a korban chatas, but it's slaughtered as a korban ola, two different types of korbanos, the wrong types of korbanos, that will make the korban chatas puzzle. So Aharon needed to slaughter Reuven's korban chatas as a korban chatas, but he slaughtered it instead as a korban ola. That's going to be a problem. But as chulin, what does chulin got to do with anything? Chulin's not a korban. Chulin's a barbecue meat with your friends on Sunday night. So therefore it's ksher. So demina machrib ba, when the psul is the same type, when it needs to be a korban chatas but it's a korban ola. They're both korbanis, but different korbanis, the wrong korbanis. It needed to be a korban chatas, but it was slaughtered as a korban ola. Machrba. It'll ruin it. In the context of korbanos, it'll be a apostle korban. Dilav mina, but if it's of a different type, we're talking about a korban chatas, and he's slaughtering it as chulin. It's not a korban bichlal. It's barbecue meat. Eina machrba. If it's a different type bichlal, if it's apples to oranges, it's not going to ruin the korban. De mina machrba, de lav mina, eina machrba. That in order to ruin, in this context, the korban, we're going to see in other contexts of Tumah and Tara and other things, but in order to ruin the korban, it would have to be the same type. If it's a different type, it would have to be an apples to apples difference. But if it's an apples to oranges difference, it's not going to ruin the korban. So let's read that again. Does Rav Yehuda Amarav really say chatas sheshchata l'shem ola psula, that a chatas, a korban chatas, that's slaughtered as a korban ola is psula, because it's apples to apples, two korbanis. Shchata l'shem chulin kshera. But if a korban chatas was slaughtered as a barbecue meat, as chulin, and just slaughtering some meat so you can eat it with your friends that night, kshera, the korban remains, the chatas remains kshera because it's lav mina, it's apples to oranges. And apples to oranges isn't going to ruin the korban. Amadamina machrivba, that in order to ruin something, in this case the korban, it would have to be the same type at least. It would have to be an apples to apples issue. Dilab mina, but if it's a different type bichlal, korbanus and chulin, le machrivba, it's not going to ruin whatever we're talking about. In this case, the korban. It's not going to ruin the korban. But viramini, but we have a question from Gittin. Kol aget shenichtav shelo lishem isha apostle, that we had learned yesterday from Gittin, that any get, I'm going to read that again, kol aget, any get shenichtav shelo lishem isha, any get that was written not for the recipient, not for the woman who was getting divorced, but for somebody else with the same name, right? It says Sarah on the get, but the truth is that get was not written for the recipient, it was written for a different Sarah. So we said that the get is psula. But now says the Gemara, Va'afilu l'shem ovedes kochavim nami pasul. And that's the question. The implication being that even if this get was written for an ovedes kochavim, it would be psula. Do you understand the question? Ovedes kochavim isn't shaykh to Gittin. There's no issues by an ovedes kochavim. There's no Gittin by ovedes kochavim. It's la mina. It's apples to oranges. Here you have a get, which is a Jewish divorce document, and it's being written with an ovedes kochavim in mind, and we're saying that the get is invalid, but why? It's eino mina. We should say dilab mina lo machrivba. That since she's not shaykh to Gittin bichlal, we have to be a Jewish woman to get involved, to get divorced with the get. She's not Jewish. So how come it's going to ruin the get? So the one here we're saying by the korbanis, it has to be of the same type in order to ruin the korban. Yet over here, you have an ovedes kochavim who's ruining a get. How could that be? We should say dilab mina in a machriba. Umishani Vishani, and he answers a beautiful answer. Get dal ovedes kochavim mine havale stome v'stome pasul. Look, by the get, it isn't actually an issue. It's the ovedes kochavim isn't the issue. The reason why the get is pasul in this case is not because it was written with the intention of an ovedes kochavim. Dal ovedes kochavim, even remove the ovedes kochavim from the get. Completely remove the ovedes kochavim from the scenario. You still don't have a kosher get. Havali stome, you'd have a undefined recipient, right? Meaning you have this get that was not written for Sarah, the recipient, it was written for Sarah, the ovedes kochavim. The issue is not that it was written for Sarah, an ovedes kochavim. That's not the issue. Forget, drop the fact that it was written for an ovedes kochavim. Okay, so if you drop that, then what do you have? You have a get just written by default. It wasn't written for Sarah. Forget about the ovedes kochavim. So you have a get that wasn't written specifically with the intent of the recipient, and by default we said that that's a posel get. Havele stama, it's a default get. V'stama posel, and a get by default, when not written explicitly with the intent of the recipient in mind, defaults to being posel. So the issue by the get is not the fact that it was written for novedis kochavim. That's not the issue. It's that it wasn't written for the intended recipient. That's the issue. Whereas kodshim, when it comes to kodshim, dal chulin minayu, if you take this chulin, which is completely irrelevant to korbanis, and you had this intention of chulin, which is completely irrelevant, throw it out, right? Get rid of the chulin aspect. What are you left with? Havle stomach v'stomach shera. Well, you'll have a korban that defaults to being kosher. So meaning, right, we're saying that if you have this different type, this apples to oranges relationship, it's irrelevant. So basically, if you take the orange away from the get, which is the fact that it was in for novedis kochavim, so take that, throw it away, what are you left with? You have a get that wasn't written with the intention of the recipient, and by default, that would default to being false. Whereas when it comes to chulin, chulin, meaning korbanis, take the orange and throw it away, take the chulin, remove it from the equation as it's irrelevant. So you have a korban, which we said yesterday, defaults to being kosher. So therefore, that is why when it comes to the korban, if it's slaughtered lishem chulin, it still remains kosher. Whereas by gittin, it will be posel, because by default the get would be posel, whereas by default a korban with an undefined intention is kosher. And now for the rest of the daf, really, we're going to be taking, as we saw just now with the korbanis and the get, we're going to be taking this concept of demina machriba, delab mina ena machriba, and we're going to be kind of testing it in different scenarios and trying to see how it holds up. Right? Because we established this concept of demina machriba. When it's an apples to apples relationship, it's gonna, right, then you have to worry about things being posel. Whereas the delab mina ena machriba, when it's apples to orange, when there's a sort of a wild card in there, it's not going to ruin anything. And we just tried to test that in the context of gittin. We're not going to test it in the context of Tumah and Tara. We're basically, for the rest of the daf, we're going to be taking this principle and be throwing different scenarios at it and kind of seeing how it holds up in different scenarios. We're going to be kind of testing that principle in different contexts. So here we go. Virama Milsa Achrise and Rave now ask another question. Mi Omar, Ravida Marab, does Ravida Marab really say chatas shchata lishem ola psula, shchata lishem chulin shera? As we asked earlier, does Ravida really say in the name of Rab that when you have a korban chatas that was slaughtered as a korban ola is psula, yet if it's slaughtered as chulin, it's kshera? Alma demina machriba. So we see that when it's an apples to apples relationship, it can ruin it, right? A korban chatas that's slaughtered as a korban ola, it'll be a problem, it'll be posel. Dila mina lemachriba. But when it's apples to oranges, when you have a korban chatas that's slaughtered as chulin, it's not going to ruin it. But here we go. V'atanya, we learn in a brayso, tocho v'lo toch tocho v'afilu klei shetef matzil. Okay, I've got a slide here. Oh, I labeled it wrong. Let's actually call it. I still labeled as Mishnaic wine press. I gotta label it as Mishnaic ovens. Perfect. Maybe even I'll call it Talmudic ovens. Okay, great. Now, I've got two ovens here on this slide. The oven on the left is an oven that you would place things in from the top, right? Both of them, I hope they look to me like both of them are earthenware ovens. Both are ovens made out of earthenware, right? So when the Torah talks about, right, these kalim, these vessels, it says, v'chol kli cheres, asher yipo me'em el tocho, kol asher b'socho yitma v'osus ishbo, right? The pasuk says, you have a klicheres and you have a dead sheretz that falls into klicheres. So here you have two different types of ovens over here, right? They look to me like they're both made out of earthenware. And if you have a dead sheretz that falls into either of those ovens, right? Let's say it falls into the oven on the left through the top, or it makes its way into the oven on the right through the side entrance, whatever it is. You have this klicheres, this earthenware vessel. You have a dead sheretz in there, and it's going to make the vessel. It's going to make the kli itself, the oven itself, is going to be tummy, and any food that's inside, right, in the photo on the right, in the oven on the right, you see there's some loaves of bread baking in that oven. Those breads, if there's a dead sheretz in that oven, those breads are going to be tummy, right? The pasuk says, right, the any of the food that's in the oven, so any breads that are baking in the oven, they are going to be tamei, and the oven itself you will have to break. So now the scenario that we're talking about is, imagine on the oven on the left, the oven that you would place things in through the top. Imagine you take some kind of like a jug or something like that, and you take the jug and you place it in the oven from the top, right? You stick it into the oven from the top, and the jug is tall enough that it's taller than the opening of the oven, right? The opening of the jug would be higher than the opening of the oven. And in that jug, there's food, drinks, things like that. And in the oven, there's a dead sheretz. So remember, let's say a dead sheretz falls into the top of the oven and there's bread baking in the oven, the bread's going to be tummy. But if you have a dead sheretz falls into the oven, and then there's a pitcher so in the oven, there's a separate vessel in the oven, this pitcher. And the pitcher is taller than the top of the oven, such that it's open to the sky, right? It's taller than the oven. So any food, drinks, and things that are in that pitcher are tahor. As we're going to learn at the end of the daf, that be'etzem any vessels that are in the oven are tahor, right? It's even in Rashi over here on the, I think 3 lines before the wide lines of Rashi over here. Where am I? Right, it's actually the first of the wide lines of Rashi. A kli doesn't become tamei me'over klicheres. So if you have a klicheres, the oven, and you have this vessel inside of the oven, and you have a dead sheretz in the oven, the vessel itself will be tahor, because ein kli mitamei me'over klicheres. A vessel inside of the oven will not become tamei. And we're saying that the jug is taller than the oven, so any of the food and drink in the jug remain tahor, as opposed to if you said, let's say, look at the oven on the right, that you would, let's say, open up from the side, and you have some jug that you stick into the oven and it's open. Well, then any food and drink that's in this open jug inside of the oven will be tamei, because even though I guess it sounds like the vessel itself would remain tahor, the vessel, right? Because we're saying the vessel itself would not become tamei over klicheres, but since the vessel is open and it's inside of the oven, well, then any food and drink that's inside of the vessel that's open to the oven, and there's a dead sheretz in the oven, any food and drink that are inside the vessel would be tamei. But if we look at the oven on the left, that you put things in from the top, and you have this jug that you place inside the oven, and the jug is taller than the oven, so any of the contents in that vessel would remain tahor. Okay. Drink a little water. So that is tocho versus tocho, right? Tocho is whatever's inside of the oven. So if the dead sheretz is in the oven, so then any of the breads that are baking in the oven, that's tocho, that's inside of the oven with the dead sheretz, they'll all be tamei. But tocho, inside of something that's inside the oven, i.e., if you take this jug and there's food and drink in the jug, and you place the jug in the oven, but the jug is taller than the oven, so this food and drink that is tocho, it's inside something it's inside of a vessel that's inside of the oven, those things will be tahor. Tocho is tamei, tocho is tahor. Okay. So now, says the Gemara, we learn in a brisa, tocho, velo toch, that which is in the oven is tamei from the dead sheretz, but not that which is in a vessel that's in the oven. Assuming that the vessel is taller than the oven. Va'afilu klei shetef matzil. And that's the question. Even if the vessel is not made out of earthenware. Earthenware, of course, one of the halachos of earthenware is that it does not become tummy from the outside, only tummy from the inside. So if you have this tamei oven, right, this oven that there's a dead sheretz in it, and you take an earthenware jug that's taller than the oven, and you stick it in to the oven, well, the earthenware vessel is not going to become tamei from the outside, and everything inside of it's going to be tahor. It's taller than the oven, etc. So everything's going to be tahor inside. But even if the vessel is made out of, let's say, metal, still, whatever is inside of that vessel would remain tahor. Now, here's the question, though. Here's the question. If we want to sort of test this concept of demina machriba, dilabmina lo machriba, that something that is of a different type is not going to ruin anything. If it's a different type, it's not going to ruin anything. So what's there to ruin over here? The tumah, right? So when you have a dead sheretz, it's in the oven, which means that anything in the oven is going to be tamei. If a dead sheretz in the oven, anything in the oven is going to be tamei. Now you take this metal vessel, let's say, and you stick it in the oven. So now we're saying that the contents of that metal vessel remain tahor, even though it's a different type. It's not earthenware, it's metal, it's a different type, and still we're saying it ruins the tumah. The tumah sheretz that's in the oven is broken by this klishetef, this, let's say, metal vessel, which is a different type. It's not earthenware. It's a klishetef. It's klishetef is a material that can go in a mikveh, can be purified in a mikveh. So that's why I'm saying metal. I assume that's a valid option. So even though it's not earthenware, it's metal, it's a different type, it's still ruining, so to speak, the tumah. The tumah is not going to be able to penetrate that metal vessel, even though it's a different type. So the question is, even though it's de'eno mino, even though it's not the same type as the earthenware, it's a different type, and yet it's machriv ba, and yet it's ruining the tumah. It's preventing the tumah from being metame, the food and drink that's inside. So that is the question. Again, testing this principle of delab mina lo machriv ba. Here we have something that's delab mina, it's a different type, and yet it is machriv ba. It's ruining the tumah. It's preventing the tumah from getting in to the food and drink that's inside of the vessel, even though, generally speaking, anything in the oven should be tamei. Vishani, and Rava then answered, Osu chulin eitzel kodshim ki mechitza eitzel toner. Mechitza eitzel toner lo mahanya lo klal. Af chulin eitzel kodshim lo mahanya lo klal. It's not toner shechotzo b'nesorim or b'yirias b'nimtza sheretz b'makom echad hakol tamei kavesh pchusa ufkuka b'kashim shushelas shushelas lover toner sheretz besocha toner besocha toner tamei sheretz b'toner olchem shebesocha tamein. Rabbi Eliezer mitar. Sorry, I read so much, but let's talk. First, let me drink some water. Okay, so interestingly, the Gemara doesn't say this, but the answer is that, well, actually, so what was the Gemara's question? The Gemara's question is that it's dilab mina. It's a different type, right? We have an earthenware vessel. We have an earthenware oven. We have this metal jug. And yet, this lab mina, this thing that's a different type, is nonetheless preventing the tumah from contaminating, from being mitame, the food and drink inside the vessel. But the Gemara answers, doesn't say it explicitly, but the Gemara answers that actually it is mina. It is the same type, and the mina machriba, because it's the same type, it does prevent the tumah from being mitame, the contents of the vessel. Why is the metal vessel the same type as the earthenware oven, which is also a vessel? Because they're both vessels, right? Just like a korban chatas and a korban ola are both korbanos, so a earthenware vessel, an earthenware oven, and a metal jug. They're both different types of vessels. And so therefore, mina machriba, if it's the same type, they're both vessels, machriba, it will ruin the tumah. It will prevent the tumah from being mitame, the contents of the jug. So to answer that question, and this is essentially going to, as I said, throughout the daf, we're going to be testing this principle of de mina machriba, de lab mina eno machriba. And often the answer is going to essentially be that, yes, while the principle is a sound principle, this is why it isn't relevant to the question that you're asking. So the reason why it's irrelevant, right, why the question is irrelevant here, is because they are actually the same type. They're both vessels. And because it's the same type, that is why the metal vessel will be able to prevent the tumah that is in the earthenware vessel from being able to contaminate its contents. But then what the Gemara continues and says, where would be a situation of de'eno mina, right? We said that the metal jug and the earthenware oven are mina. They're the same type. They're both vessels. So what is a different type? What's eno mina? Where we would say delab mina eno machrivba. That when it's a different type, it's not going to ruin anything. And in this case, it's not going to prevent the tumah from spreading. Well, for example, what if you have an earthenware vessel? What if you have an earthenware vessel, right? So let's say you have, for example, I don't know if it has to be one or the other, but let's say you have, for example, the oven on the right. Hopefully this is a good, I don't see why it should be a problem. So let's say you have the oven on the right, okay? That is totally closed on the top. You load it in from the side. And let's say on the left side of that oven, there is a dead sheretz. On the left side of the oven, there's a dead sheretz. And you want to bake bread on the right side of the oven. So what you do is you build a mechitza. You build a separator, a divider inside of the oven. Take some. So the Gemara says either take some. You decide you'll take some wood or some kind of a curtain or something like that. You'll make a divider inside of the oven, divide it in half. And that way, the dead sheretz will be on the left side of the oven. And then on the right side of the mechitza in the oven will be your bread. So we say in that case, the tumah will spread. Because what are you banking on to prevent the tumah from spreading? This mechitza. A mechitza is not a vessel. It's not a kli. And you're making it out of wood. You're making it out of some kind of a cloth, which is a different type. It's a different material. It's not earthenware. So here you have something that is not a vessel. It's a different material. So it's de'eno mina. It's completely a different type. And eina machriba, it's not going to ruin, it's not going to prevent the tumah from spreading. So in that case, the tumah will spread and be mitame all of the contents of the oven. Okay, so it's really inside, right? So Vishani, so Rava answered. Now again, it doesn't say this explicitly, but the answer to the question that was asked about how could this metal jug prevent the spread of the tumah from an earthenware oven, the answer is that, well, it's the same type. They're both vessels, and because they're both vessels, the metal jug will sort of prevent, it will ruin, so to speak, the tumah and prevent it from contaminating the food and drink inside the metal jug. Now, also chulin, they made chulin eitzel kachim. So when you have the apples to oranges example of chulin relative to kachim, you have korbanos and you have chulin, two entirely separate things. Kimechitza eitzel taner, right? Like we talked about a minute ago. It's like if you build a mechitza, a divider inside of an oven. It's not a vessel. It's a completely foreign thing. It's an apples to oranges kind of thing. Ma mechitza eitzel taner lo mahanya lo klal. Just like building a mechitza, a divider in a taner, is not going to prevent the tumah from spreading. The eina mina eina machriv ba. I'm saying that. It's not in the Gemara. I'm saying that because it's an entirely foreign item, it will not prevent the spread of the tumah. So av chulin etzel kachim. So also when you have chulin, relative to kachim, you have a korban chatas that you slaughter as a barbecue. Well, that's not going to ruin lo mahanya leklal. It is not going to ruin the validity of the korban. The Tanan, as we learn in a Mishnah. Where's this Mishnah? Probably in Kalim. Whenever you have a Mishnah from Kalim, you know it's going to be fun times. The Tanan toner shechatzitzo b'nesarim. If you have a oven that you divide with planks of wood, with is planks the word I'm thinking of, slats of wood, or biyirias, or with some kind of cloth of sorts. V'nimtza sheretz b'makom echon, and on one side of the mechitza is a dead sheretz. Hakol tameh. Well, even what's on the other side of the mechitza is also going to be tameh, because the mechitza is a completely foreign thing, and it's not going to prevent the spread of the tumah. Kaveris, if you have a basket of sorts, she'i pchusa, and it's in a bad state. You have a very you have a basket that is not good. It's seen better days. A basket that has seen better days, and it's to the extent that it's not even a vessel anymore. It's not even a kli. It's in bad shape. It wouldn't even be considered a kli anymore. Ufikuka bikash, and you take some straw, and all the holes that are in the basket, you plug them up with straw. It's not going to help. It's not going to be considered a vessel, right? We had talked about how when you have a metal jug inside of an oven, they're both vessels. This is not a vessel. This is not a vessel. This is not going to be considered tocho. No way. And you lower, right? So if you imagine the oven on the left, and you lower this basket into the oven from the top. Sheretz besocha hataner tamei. If there is a dead sheretz in this basket that is not considered a vessel, would not be considered tocho, wouldn't be considered a kli. So then it's going to be like, so if there's a dead sheretz in this basket, well, it's going to be considered like there's a dead sheretz in the oven, and the oven is tamei. Sheretz besoner. And if there's a dead sheretz in the oven, and there's food and drink in this basket, so then any food that's in the basket is going to be tamei. And it's not going to be considered like it's a klisha, tocho, a vessel inside. No, it's just going to be considered like everything's just together in the oven. Okay. Eliezer mitahir. Okay, now here's where things get juicy. Now, well, I don't know if I would say juicy, but this is where the machlokes comes in. This is where we gotta do some get to work a little bit. So Eliezer says tahor. What's tahor? Well, let me drink a little water. What's tahor? Rabbi Eliezer says that when you have this oven, right? If we take, for example, the oven on the right, and you build a mechitza, you build some kind of a divider inside of that oven. There's a sheretz on the left side of the oven. There's bread on the right side of the oven. Rabbi Eliezer says tahor. Rabbi Eliezer says that the bread on the right side of the mechitza will be tahor, because the mechitza does make a valid divider in the oven. And if you have a divider in the middle of the oven, you have a dead sheretz on the left side. You have bread baking on the right side. The bread is going to be tahor, according to Rabbi Eliezer. That mechitza is valid. Amar Rabbi Eliezer, kal v'chomer. And Rabbi Eliezer says, I'll tell you why I say that the mechitza is valid. Well, in hitzil b'meis hachomer lo tatzul b'klicheres hakal. Rabbi Eliezer says, I'll tell you why. When it comes to Tumah ha'oel, you have a corpse in a house, right? So let's say you have in a house, let's say you have in the living room a dead body, right? Somebody passed away in the living room, and there is a room off of the living room, and it's got a door, and the door is closed. So anything that's in that room is going to be tahor. Meaning you have a divider, you have mamish in aviyavos tumah, in the main room. You have a corpse in the main room, in aviyavos tumah. A divider, i.e. a closed door, is going to prevent that tumah from spreading, and anything in that room off of the main room is going to be ta'or. So Rabbi Eliezer says, look, if a divider is able to prevent tumas hames from spreading, the tumah-iest of all tumas, a divider prevents that from spreading. Certainly, when we're talking about a sheretz, which is not an aviyavos tumah, it's an ava tumah. A divider inside of the oven should successfully prevent the spread of the tumas hasheretz. So again, Rabbi Eliezer, kavachomer im hitzil b'meis achomer, if a divider can prevent the spread of tumas hameis, which is the most stringent of tumos, lo tatzil b'chlicheres akal, certainly it should be able to prevent the spread of tumah of the sheretz inside of the oven. If there's a divider in the middle, that should be sufficient, argues Rabbi Eliezer. Amulo, they say to Rabbi Eliezer, leim hitzil b'meis achomer shekein chaluka oyalin, to which the chacham respond to Rabbi Eliezer. They say, well, what's that sound? Anyways, so it's not such a great argument, they say to Rabbi Eliezer, because when it comes to Masa Oel, it's so, what does Rashi say? How does Rashi explain it? Where am I? Oh, sheken choken derech b'nei adam lachlok ohalin b'mechitza hilkach oil achrina hu. Rashi says, well, it's normal for people to divide up living spaces with dividers and with walls, and therefore if you have this main room and you have a divider and off of the main room there's a separate room, like it's considered a separate space. Like that's a normal thing that you do. People divide up spaces in that way, and therefore the different spaces will be considered different spaces. And yes, a divider will prevent tumas hameis from spreading. That's correct. But tatzu b'chlicheres akal shein chalukin. So it says here b'ohalin, but you can the goes with you change it to klicheres. The point is, you have people don't usually put mechitzas into ovens. That's not like a norm. Maybe you could do it, but it's not like a normal thing. Making walls in living spaces, that's a very normal thing to do, and it's accepted that making a wall will create different spaces, and therefore having a different space divided by a wall will prevent the spread of tumas hameis. However, when you have it's not the normal way to like divide up an oven with like a mechitza, and therefore, in this particular case, the Chacham argue that when you build up mechitza in an oven, it's going to be irrelevant. And don't make me the kal v'chomer to say if it prevents the spread of tumas hameis, it should definitely prevent it in an oven. They disagree and say it makes sense in the context of a living space. It doesn't make sense in the context of an oven, and therefore they argue that the mechitza in the oven, which is a completely foreign thing, it's she'eno mino, ein machriv ba, it's not going to prevent the spread of the tumas hasheretz in the oven. So now, says the Gemara, Hateinach lirabona. So I understand. So here we go. Getting back to our attempt to apply this principle of the mina machriv ba, the lav mina eina machriv ba. We have this concept of when it's apples to apples, it could ruin things. For example, if you have a korban chatas and a korban ola, two different types of korbanos, it's going to ruin the korban. And we said also, when you have a oven, which is a kli, an earthenware kli, and you have a jug in the oven and it's taller than the oven, even if it's made out of metal, it doesn't matter. They're both different types of jugs. And it is going to, right, so you have the earthenware oven, you have the metal jug. The metal jug is going to prevent, it's going to ruin, it's going to prevent the spread of the tumah. But the eino mina, eino machriv ba. But if it's it's an apples to oranges kind of thing. For example, you have chulin, right? You slaughter a korban chatas as chulin, it's not going to ruin the korban. And we said also, if you have a mechitza in an oven, that mechitza is not going to ruin. Mechitza isn't a kli. It's not going to ruin. It's not going to ruin the spread. It's not going to prevent the spread of the tumah inside of the oven. So that was the opinion of the chachamim. So our principle of the mina machriv ba, the eina mina lo machriv ba, that holds up according to the chachamim. Again, the mina machriv ba, when it's the same type, such as the oven and the metal jug, machriv ba, it prevents the spread of the tumah. But the eina mina lo machriv ba. But when it's a different type, for example, you have the oven and there's a tumas sheretz in the oven, and now the ein amino, you construct a wall into a mechitza inside the oven, forget it. It's not going to ein machriv, but it's not going to prevent the spread of the tumah. So according to the chacham, that's fine. But according to Rabbi Eliezer, he had said that actually, when you implement the mechitza in the oven, it will prevent the spread of the tumah. So even though it's ein amina, even though it's a different type, you have an oven and you're putting a mechitza in it, it's a different type. And yet, we want to say the eina mina eina machriv ba, but here it is the eina mina machriv ba according to Rabbi Eliezer. Even though it's a different type, it's preventing the spread. It's going to ruin the tumah. It's going to prevent the spread of the tumah to the other side of the mechitza. So again, if we're taking this principle that we've established of the mina machriv ba, the eina mina lo machriv ba, it stands up great according to the chacham. It doesn't seem to be standing up according to Rabbi Eliezer. So, it says the Gemara, third line of Daf Gimel Amud Beis, Ha'teinach l'Rabbanan. So this principle of ours of the mina machriv ba, de la binena machriv ba, so that works out according to the Chacham. That works out great. But Rabbi Eliezer, Michael Meimar, what are you going to say about Rabbi Eliezer? Because he's saying that even when you have the mechitza, it's the eina mina, still it's machriv ba, it's going to prevent the spread of the tumah. Well, I'll tell you something. Says the Gemara, I'll tell you something. Listen to this, says the Gemara. I'll tell you something. Rabbi Eliezer agrees with the principle. Rabbi Eliezer agrees with our principle. Demina machriba, delad mina, ena machriba. That when you implement something that is not of the same type, well, for example, you have an oven and you build a mechitza in the oven, ena machriba, it won't prevent the spread of the tumah. You hear that? In principle, Rabbi Eliezer agrees. You build a mechitza in an oven, it's not lo machriba, it's not going to prevent the spread of the tumah, of the sheretz. And the bread on the other side of the mechitza in the oven is going to be tummy. So why does Rabbi Eliezer say it's tahor? I'll tell you why. Because of the kal v'chomer that he mentioned. In principle, yeah. When there's no kal v'chomer, when there's no reason to say otherwise, sure, Rabbi Eliezer agrees. In principle, the eino mina lo machriba. When you have something, apples to oranges, you have something that's a different type, it's not going to ruin anything. In this case, it's not going to prevent the spread of the tumah. But there's a kal v'chomer here. There's a reason to say otherwise. There's an argument to be made to the contrary in this case, which is, well, if a mechitza prevents tumas ames, aviyavos tumah, certainly it could prevent the spread of tumas sheretz. So Rabbi Eliezer actually will argue that he holds of the principle, the eina mina lo machriba. In principle, he holds of that. In this case, it just happens to be that there's a reason to say otherwise. If it spreads the tumas ames, of course, it spreads tumas sheretz. So Rabbi Eliezer. Rabbi Eliezer says, look, I agree with you in principle that the eino mina lo machriba. However, we have a kal v'chomer in this case to say that the mechitza, which is eino mina, nonetheless should be able to prevent the spread of the tumas sheretz. If that's the case, says the Gemara, hasum nami lema kal v'chomer. To which the Gemara says, one second. If that's really the case, that in principle Rabbi Eliezer holds of just that there's a reason to say otherwise here. But he would agree that when it comes to korbanis, you have a korban chatas that you're slaughtering as a. You have a korban chatas that you're slaughtering as a. No, I'm sorry. You have a korban chatas that you're slaughtering as chulin. Rabbi Eliezer would say it's not going to prevent, it's not going to ruin the tumah. What am I talking about? It's not going to ruin the korban, right? Again, right? Exactly. Right, meaning Rabbi Eliezer, in principle, agrees with the concept, right? And therefore, right? So Rabbi Eliezer would say, look, when it comes to the korbanos, when you have chulin, which is the eina mina, eina machab, it's not going to ruin the korban, right? You have a korban chatas that you slaughter as chulin, it's not going to ruin it, and therefore, in principle, when it came to the oven, you have the oven, you build a mechitza, it's a separate thing. It shouldn't spread the tumah, it shouldn't prevent the spread of the tumah sheseretz. But we have a kal v'chomer. But 1 second, I could also make a kal v'chomer when it comes to korbanos as well. What's the kal v'chomer? Kodshim michalin kodshim, chulin lo kol shekain. Well, if we're talking about being mechalel kodshim, right? You have a korban. You're talking about, are you pasling the korban? Are you ruining the korban? You're being mechalel, making it chulin, the korban. If kodshim can make a korban chulin, if you have a korban chatas, but you slaughter it as a korban ola, it's going to be mechalel the korban. It's going to ruin, can make chulin the korban. Well, certainly chulin can make chulin the korban. If you slaughter a korban with the intention of chulin, certainly it should ruin the korban. If an intention of kodshim could be mechalel a korban, certainly the intention of chulin should be able to be mechalel a korban. So again, back to Rabbi Eliezer. We want to say Rabbi Eliezer in principle agrees with Mino machivla delab mino ein machivla. In principle, he agrees with it. And therefore, when it came to the oven and you introduced a foreign thing, it should not prevent the spread of the tumah in the oven. But there was a kal v'chomer to be made. But if that's the case, then Rabbi Eliezer, we should make the kal v'chomer also by the korbanos and say that the chulin should ruin the korban as well. Because kal v'chomer is, if kodshim can be mechal a korban, certainly chulin can be mechal the korban. So therefore, why would Rabbi Eliezer agree when it comes to the korban that the chulin is not going to ruin the korban, yet when it comes to the oven, he says that the mechitza will prevent the spread of the tumah. So says the Gemara, at the time of the Rav, Rab Elazar, there's a different principle of Rab Illa. Let's change it to Rab Illa, why not? Rab Illa, Dam Rab Illa, my time of the Rav, v'lo yechalalu, as kodshe b'nei Yisrael, es asher yarimu l'Hashem, kodshim, michalalim kodshim, v'in chulin, michalalim kodshim. So, says the Gemara, okay, enachinami, right? So meaning, if we're trying to explain that Rabbi Eliezer really agrees in principle with Demino Machrivla, Delab Mino, Ein Machrivla. Right, and that when it came to the oven, in principle, the mechitza should not ruin the spread of the tumah, but because of the kal v'chomer, it does. We said, okay, well then, he should also say that when it comes to the korbanos, we should make the kal v'chomer to say that chulin should ruin the korban. To which you say, well, the thing is, we actually additionally have a pasuk when it comes to the korbanos to say that chulin will not passel the korban. Right? Right? They will not be mechal the kodshe b'nei Yisrael, from which we learn out kodshim, michalim kodshim, that it's specifically kodshim. It has to be a korban that's going to ruin the korban. Ve'ein chulin michalim kodshim, but chulin will not passel a korban. Okay, so yes, okay, if there is a kal v'chomer, it can override sort of this principle of dilav mina lo machriba. Sure, if we have a kal v'chomer, it can override that, but a pasuk will override that. And by korbanos, we have a pasuk to say that you dafka need a korban to passel a korban, not chulin to passel a korban. So alma. So the Gemara says, okay, fine. So what do we see? Also, kra abke kal v'chomer. Okay, fine. So it sounds like a kal v'chomer could override the principle of delab mina lo machriba, but a pasuk will override that. Well, if that's the case, let's say by Rabbi Eliezer, Hochanami leise tocho lapke mikal v'chomer. Well, according to Rabbi Eliezer, so you had this kal v'chomer to say, well, if this mechitza prevents the spread of tumas hamei, certainly it prevents the spread of tumas hasheretz. But what about the fact that we have the pasuk of tocho, that anything in the oven becomes tummy, right? We said tocho, so tocho is permitted, but anything in the oven is going to be tummy. So building the mechitza is not going to prevent anything. So Rabbi Eliezer wanted to make this kal v'chomer that the mechitza should be able to prevent the spread, right? If it could prevent the spread of tumas hamei, it could prevent the spread of the tumas sheretz, and therefore the bread on the other side of the mechitza is tahor. But what about the fact that we have this pasuk of tocho to say that anything in the oven is tummy? And that should override the kal v'chomer that you want to make to say that the food on the other side of the mechitza should be tahor. But we have a pasuk above that which says that anything in the oven, everything in the oven should become tummy. So, hi tocho mibayile leochlin shegiblon betit v'echnison le'avir toner. So says Rabbi Eliezer, well, no. Says Rabbi Eliezer, I'm still going to say that if you have a mechitza in the oven, it's going to prevent the tumas hasheretz from spreading to the other side of the mechitza, and the food, the bread baking on the other side of the mechitza is going to remain tahor. Okay, what about the fact that the pasuk says tocho, anything in the oven is going to be tamei. Tocho is tahor. If you have some kind of jug in there, whatever's in the jug is tahor, but everything else is tamei. Well, what it's coming to exclude is anything in the jug is tahor. But if you take some kind of food and you, what do we say? If you have food that you somehow coat in some kind of a dirt, like mud, and then you dangle that into the oven. So I may have thought to say, Hoil uvinegia lo mitamo, ve'avir nami lo mitamo. I may have needed to say that, well, since the dead sheretz touches this mud-coated food, since it's only coming in contact with the mud, it wouldn't make the food tummy. Okay. So I may have thought that when you dangle into the other klicheres, it would remain tahor, kamaj malan, that it's tummy. Meaning, what Rabbi Eliezer, meaning if you want to say that when we have the pasuk of tocho, to say that should say that everything in the tummy is, that everything in the oven is tummy, even regardless of what side of the mechitza you're on. So we say, no, the pasuk is not teaching that. No, the mechitza is gonna prevent the stuff on the other side from becoming tummy. But the pasuk of tocho is teaching is that if you have tocho, if you have this jug inside the oven, so the context of that would be tahor. But if you take this food and you coat it in mud and you dangle that in the oven, that will be tummy. If you have mechitza, whatever's on the other side of the mechitza will be tahor based on the kal v'chomer from tumas hamei. But if you take this food and you dangle it in the oven, that would be tummy. That's what he learns out from that pasuk, not to override the mechitza kal v'chomer. Okay. The rabbis say we don't need a pasuk to specifically teach me about the food, because basically they would say anything outside of the jug, right? Meaning whatever's in the jug is tahor, but everything else is going to be tamei, including whatever's on the other side of this mechitza that you make and anything that you dangle in there. All that stuff would be tamei. Anything other than the whatever's in the toch, whatever's in this metal, whatever's in this jug. But otherwise, everything is going to be tamei, and even if you build a mechitza in there, it's going to be delav mino lo machrivla. It's a different type, and it's not going to prevent the spread of the sheretz. Sheesh. Wow. Okay. Well, we just completed that section. Sheesh. Okay. Well, that was a sort of deep dive in really putting that principle of demina machrivba, delav mina lo machrivba, really putting that principle to the test in some tricky Tumah and Tara ways. Wow. Now says the Gemara, Rav Yosef bar Ami Rami Shinui kodesh, ashinui bailim, umishane. Wow. Givaldic. So if Yosef Barami, he asked the question of Shinui Kodesh and Shinui Bailim. Right. So I think I'd mentioned this in the introduction to today's Daf. Right. So we've been talking about lishmah and lishem Bailim. So Shinui Kodesh is what we've been talking about now, slaughtering a chatas with the intention of an ola. That's Shinui Kodesh. That's lishmah. And then there's Shinui Bailim, which is slaughtering Ruvain's korban for Shimon's. Now, let me actually, I'll just tell you now, because it's important in terms of understanding Shinui Bailim, how exactly it works. Listen to this, Chevra. It's important. Masechta Zevachim is a difficult Masechta, and the devil is in the details over here. The details are important over here. If it's not important now, it's going to be important tomorrow. And now that we're introducing Shinui Bailim, let's discuss the way that Shinui Bailim works. So now, when it comes to Shinui Kodesh, right? So if you slaughter a chatas with the intention of ola, okay, it's pretty straightforward, right? If we use Aharon, the Kohen who's doing the avoda, so if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas as an ola, that's Shinui Kodesh. Additionally, if Aharon does Kabbalah Sadam of Ruvain's chatas as an ola, or Holacha Sadam, or Zrika Sadam of Ruvain's chatas as an ola. So in all those cases, that would be Shinui Kodesh. However, the way that Shinui Bailim works, Ruvain's korban for Shimon, what it is that it's not that Aharon is slaughtering Ruvain's korban on behalf of Shimon, right? It is not that Aharon is slaughtering Ruvain's korban with the intention of slaughtering it for Shimon. No. It's that Aharon is slaughtering Ruvain's korban with the intent of then doing Zrika Sadam for Shimon. Because Zrika Sadam is the most important part of the korban. That's where the kapara is. That's the main thing. So Shinui Bailim is that Aharon is slaughtering Ruvain's korban with the intention not of slaughtering it for Shimon, but of then doing the Zrika Sadam for Shimon. He does the Kabbalah Sadam on Ruvain's korban with the intention of doing Zrika Sadam for Shimon. He does Holacha Sadam on Ruvain's korban with the intention of doing Zrika Sadam for Shimon. The main thing when it comes to Shinui Bailim is really the Zrika Sadam. So it's that he does any of the Avodo Sadam, whether it's Shchita, whether it's Kabbalah, whether it's Holacha, whether it's Zrika. He does any of those with the intention of doing Zrikas Hadam for Shimon. That's what Shinui Bailim is. Okay, now, drink a little more water. So Rav Yosef Bar Ami Rami Shinui Kodesh Shinui Bailim Umishani. Rav Yosef Bar Ami asks a question from Shinui Kodesh, which is lishmah, to Shinui Bailim, which is lishem Bailim. Umishani, and he answers it. Here's the question. Mi Amar Rav, does Rav say chatas shesh chata lishem chatas kshera, okay, kshera lishem ola psula amadelav mina machriba demina lo machriba. Wow. And here we get to sort of, the relative nature of that principle. Again, right, what we're doing today is we're taking this concept of, the concept we've been working with is Dilab mina, right? The mina machriba, dilab mina lo machriv ba. But now we are putting that concept to the test a bit more. And what the question is that Rav says that chatas. Let's read inside. Mi Omar Rav chatas sheshchata l'shem chatas kshera. A chatas that's slaughtered as a chatas is kshera. What does that mean? Obviously, a chatas that's slaughtered as a chatas is kshera. What it means is that, a chatas could be brought for different reasons. Okay? A chatas could be brought because you accidentally ate chelev. A chatas could also be brought because you accidentally ate blood. So what Rav is saying is that if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas, now Aharon says, okay, Givaldig, I'm slaughtering a chatas for Ruvain, but Aharon thinks it's because Ruvain ate dam, and that's why Ruvain's bringing the korban chatas, but in fact, it's because Ruvain ate chelev. So it's kshera. So even though Aharon thinks that he's slaughtering the korban chatas for Ruvain because Ruvain ate dam, and really Ruvain's bringing the korban because he ate chelev, it doesn't matter. That is okay. But if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas as in ola, then that is going to be a problem. So in this context, right, we said a chatas is kshera, a chatas as in ola is psula. So relatively speaking, what we want to say is that we see from here is that demina, chatas and chatas, lo machriv ba, is not going to ruin it. And delab mina, chatas and ola, machriv ba is going to ruin it. Which is interesting because before we were considering chatas and ola to be mina, the same type, they're both korbanos. Now we're saying that chatas and chatas, relatively speaking, chatas and chatas are mina, chatas and ola are lav mina. So if we take this principle and say that if you slaughter the chatas as a chatas, or a chelev chatas as a dam chatas, we say it's kshera. So in this context, the mina lo machriba, and then you have if you slaughter the chatas as an ola, which is, we want to say in this context is the lav mina machriba, it'll be possible. And this is in the context of course, shinui kodesh, right? Lishmah. So again, mi'omer Rav, does Rav say, chatas sheshchatu l'shem chatas, if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas as a chatas, i.e., Ruvain's chatas, which he was bringing for chelev, Aharon slaughtered it because he thought that Ruvain was bringing it for dam, kshera, the chatas is kshera, lishem ola psula, but if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas as an ola, it's psula. Now, relatively speaking, Alma, what do we see? The lav mina, chatas and ola, machriv bo. The lav mina is ruining it. The mina, but chatas and chatas, lo machriv bo, is fine. But Rav says in the context of shinui bailim, chatas sheshchoto al mi shemechuyev chatas psula, ami shemechuyev ola kshera. Interesting. So if you have Ruvain and Shimon, Ruvain needs to bring a korban chatas. Shimon also needs to bring a korban chatas. They both have to bring a korban chatas. And Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intent of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who also has to bring a korban chatas. So in that case, we say psula. But if Shimon had to bring a korban ola, so Reuven has to bring a korban chatas, Shimon has to bring a korban ola, and Aharon slaughters Reuven's chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who needs to bring an ola, that is kshera. So what do we see? So in this case, we see demina machriv ba, that when it's the same type, it'll ruin it, right? Both Reuven and Shimon have to bring a chatas, and that'll ruin it. But when Reuven brings a chatas and Shimon has to bring an ola, the lav mina lo machriv ba, doesn't ruin it. So we had said when it came to shinui kodesh, we were saying, right, chatas and chatas is kshera, so the mina lo machriv ba, and chatas and ola is psula, the lav mina machriv ba. And over here we're saying the opposite. Chatas and chatas ruins it by shinui bailim. So the mina machriv ba, but if Reuven brings a chatas and Shimon has to bring an ola, the lav mina lo machriv ba. So those are opposite principles. It's a lot to keep in mind, but those are basically opposing principles. Drink a little more water. So again, Rav Yosef bar Ami Rami Shinur Kodesh Shinur Bailim Mashani. Rav Yosef bar Ami asked opposing principles from Shinur Kodesh and Shinur Bailim, and he answers, Mi Amar Rav, does Rav say chatas sheshchatu l'shem chatas, when Ruvain needs to bring a korban chatas for chelev, and Aharon slaughters the chatas with intention of it being for a chatas for a dam, kshera, that's kshera. Lishem ola psula, but if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas as an ola, it is pesula. Alma tilab mina machriba, when it's a different type, chatas and ola psula. Demina lo machriba, when it's the same type, a chatas and a chatas, albeit one is chaylev, one is dam, but they're both chatases. Right? Lo machriba, it's fine. But ve'amar Rabba, when it comes to shinui bailim, chatas sheshchata mishum mechuyev chatas, that if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who also needs to bring a korban chatas, psula, amishum mechuyev ola ksheira. But if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who needs to bring a korban ola ksheira, it's fine. Alma debarmina machriv ba, right? When both Ruvain and Shimon need to bring a chatas, it's going to be a problem if Aharon slaughters Ruvain's chatas with the intention of doing zukas adam for Shimon. But delatmina, when Shimon has to bring an ola, lo machriv ba, Aharon slaughtering Ruvain's korban chatas with the intention of doing zukas adam for Shimon, who needs to bring an ola, it's not going to ruin it. So we have opposing, basically opposite principles from shinui kodesh and shinui bailim umishane, and Rav Yosef Brahmi answers. So basically the answer is going to be based on psukim. So Mishani, look, Hasam, when it comes to the shinui kodesh, when it comes to Aharon slaughtering Ruvain's korban chatas as a korban chatas, just that Ruvain was bringing it for chaylev and Aharon thought he was bringing it for dam, v'shachat osa lichatos, amrachman v'arei chatos, lishim chatos nishchito. Right? The pasuk says, "V'samach yado al rosho v'shachat osa lichatos." Right? Look, when it comes to shinui kodesh, when it came to the scenario where Reuven had to bring a korban chatas for chaylev and Aharon slaughtered it for a korban chatas for dam, look, it's still a chatas. Right, Reuven had to bring a chatas. Aharon was slaughtering it as a chatas. So it says v'shachat osa lechatas. You have to slaughter it as a chatas. And Aharon slaughtered Reuven's chatas as a chatas. But hacha, when it comes to shinui bailin, what does the pasuk say? B'chipur olav ksiv olav v'lo al chavero. That it says Aharon needs to do shchita. Well, it does need to v'chiper. Right, v'chiper is zrikas adam. The kapara is in the zrika, right? Which is why I clarified that the main thing by shinui bailim is that the kavana for this to do the zrika, the kapara v'chiper alav. So it says that Aharon needs to atone for Reuven, not for Shimon. Not for Shimon. But Shimon needs to be similar to Reuven. It has to be an apples to apples thing. That it's only going to be a violation of Shinui Bailim. Right? This is V'chipar Olav. Aharon needs to be offering the korban for Reuven, not for Shimon. Shimon and Reuven have to be apples to apples. They both have to bring korban chatases. So if Aharon is slaughtering Reuven's korban with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, and they both have to bring korban chatases, so that's going to be a problem, because that's be for Reuven, not for Shimon. But when Reuven's chatas and Shimon's ola, then they're not similar, and therefore it's not going to be a violation of a chipur olav, and it's going to be kosher in that case. So again, we have our principle that we've been working with, which is demina machriba, delad mina lo machriba, and we were kind of like putting it through the ringer, that, well, it implies one thing when it comes to Shinui Kodesh, something else when it comes to Shinui Bailim. We say, look, it's all based on psukim. At the end of the day, the psukim teach us by Shinui Kodesh this, and it teaches by Shinui Bailim that, and everything has to sort of fit in with their respective halachas and psukim. And finally, to wrap up, Rav Chaviv Rami, Shinui Bailim, Atoch Tocho Umishani. Rav Chaviva asked the question of Shinui Bailim to Tocho, and he answers, Yamarav Chatos, Chatos Shechota, Amishim Chuyiv Chatos, Psula, Amishim Chuyiv Ola Kshera. When it comes to Shinui Bailim, does Rav really say that when Aharon slaughters Reuven's chatas with the intention of doing zrikas adam for Shimon, who also needs to bring a korban chatas, so that's psula. But if Shimon needs to bring a korban ola, it's kshera. So alma demina machriv ba Delav mina lo machriv ba. So that means the mina machriv. When it's the same type, both chatases, it's a problem. When it's a different type, chatas and ola, it's okay. It's not going to ruin the korban. But we learned in the Brisa, tocho velo tocho, like we learned earlier. Whatever is in the oven becomes tummy, not what's in a jug that's in the oven. Afilu kli shetif, and even if that jug is made out of, let's say, metal. So we see that the oven is earthenware, the jug is metal, so it's a different type. So eino mino, and yet it's preventing the spread of the tumas sheretz. So it's eino mino, and yet it is machriv ba. So afilu kli shetif matzah, even a metal jug will prevent the spread of the tumah, right? So we see the eino mino and yet machriv ba. So mishane, and we answer arba'a tocho ksive. Look, it's from a pasuk. It says there are 4 tochs in that pasuk. Right? If you look at that pasuk, I'm going to read the pasuk. V'chol kli cheres asher yipol mehem el tocho kol asher bit tocho yitma v'osu sishba. Right? It could have said toch, but it says tocho. So it says tocho twice in the pasuk. Each time it could have said toch, but it says tocho. So you have toch, tocho, toch, tocho. It gives us an opportunity to learn out 4 things. Number 1, toch, tocho. Wait, what? Okay, where am I? Okay, fine. I bought tocho. See, if it says tocho 4 times, tocho, as I just explained, it says tocho twice in the pasuk. Each time it could have said toch, but it says tocho, so you have tocho. That's for 4. You have 4 things to learn. So chad legufe, 1 is simply to teach, like kol tocho besocho yitma, right? That any food that's in the oven is going to be tameh. As simple as that. V'chad l'gzer shava, 1 for the gzer shava. What that gzer shava teaches is that the oven itself is going to be tameh. So you have a dead sheretz, falls into the oven. All the food in the oven is tameh. That's the first thing that we learned. But also the tameh, the oven itself is going to be tameh. Chad tocho shel zeh v'lo tocho shel acher. The other one teaches that any vessel that's inside of the oven is going to be tahor, right? Any kli shebesocho is going to be tahor. Ve'idach, and finally, where am I? Fine. Idach, and finally, tocho v'lo tocho v'afilu kli shetef matzu. It says tocho and not tocho. Not if you have a jug that's inside of the oven. Whatever's inside of that jug will be tahor, and even if it is afilu kli shetef matzil, and even if it's made of a different material, it is still going to be considered tocho, and it'll be tahor. So that is why, even though it sounds like it is eino mino, it is still going to prevent the spread of the tumah. Givaldig. That was the Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. Wow, it's a piece of work. I'm telling you, Zevachim is a piece of work. At least what I've learned so far. It's work. It's Givaldig. But it's work, friends. It's work. So we learned about, so really the big sort of principle we were working through on today's daf is this principle of, that we established at the beginning, is mino machriv ba, delav mino lo machriv ba, that when you have something, right, an apples to apples kind of thing, that can, whether it's pasling a korban, or we saw in context of different contexts, whatever, tumentar, whatever. So if it's the say sort of an apples to apples thing can ruin stuff, but an apples to oranges thing won't ruin things. And then we kind of tested that out and wrangled it through different scenarios and asked questions. Sometimes maybe it actually sounds like it's the opposite, that when it's the same type, it doesn't ruin things. When it's different types, it ruins things. And we kind of like explored and studied these different scenarios in order to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing. Sometimes because of gzer shava or gzer sakasiv. So depending on these contexts, so slaughtering a chatas as chulin, of course, we started off by saying that if you slaughter a chatas as an ola, it will be possible. But as chulin, it's not going to be possible. It'll still be fine because it's not even a korban b'chlal. The tumah of vessels within vessels, that was a tricky sugya that had sort of lots of different angles to it. I'm not going to go through all of the angles now, but in principle, the concept of Demino Machrba, the Lav Mino Lo Machrba kind of was upheld. We had some interesting discussions there about Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. We wanted to say that he also in principle holds of that, just that he was working with other sort of kal v'chomers and reasons why in some cases you would not apply that principle, based on if there's a kal v'chomer or some other reason. And then comparing lishmah and lishem bailim, which we referred to as shinui kodesh and shinui bailim, and we got into a little bit how shinui bailim works, that the main thing is really the kapara, v'chiper, olav, the zrikas adam, and how that exactly works. It would only be an issue of shinui bailim if Aharon was slaughtering the chatas of Reuven in order to do zrikas adam for Shimon, if Shimon was also bringing a korban chatas, not if he was bringing a korban olav. Well, that was Daf Gimel of Masechta Zevachim. It was really had to work through that daf. Givaldig. I'll catch you tomorrow for Daf Dal, which is another daf. These dafs are great, but they're work. We're gonna have to work through these dafs. We're gonna have to work through these dafs, but they're really, really, really great. And so are you. And I will catch you tomorrow. Cheers.